They move up the pyramid, the more they realize that, the outlets really aren't interested in major news that rocks the boat.
The boat Charles refers to belongs to those at the top of the pyramid, where the interests of the media outlets are quietly defined. The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. congressional record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda. CFR members include America's wealthiest tycoons, as well as the highly placed elite in government, academic institutions, tax-exempt foundations, and the establishment media. Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar. NBC's Tom Brokaw, CBS's Dan Rather, ABC's Barbara Walters, Jim Lehrer of PBS, William F. Buckley of National Review, media mogul Rupert Murdoch, owner of the giant multifaceted News Corporation. These media heavyweights, and many others like them, are members of the CFR. Powerful corporations are also invited to become members. At the close of the 20th century, CFR influence presided over far-reaching consolidations of media control. In 1995, CFR members Michael Eisner of Disney and ABC's Thomas Murphy merged their media empires. Soon after the merger, the Disney-ABC empire becomes a CFR corporate member. In the year 2000, the world's largest internet service provider, America Online, joins forces with Time Warner, one of the world's largest news organizations. The CEOs favoring the move are CNN's Thomas Johnson and Time Warner's Gerald Levin, both CFR members. Once again, another media giant is created under the shadow of CFR influence. Today, an elite handful of individuals define the agendas that are supported by the empire of establishment news. One of the CFR's strongest media allies is the New York Times. As a major outlet for the establishment viewpoint, the Times has achieved dominant influence over the reporting of national and international news. The Times is relied upon by many editors in the mainstream news media for direction on how to portray world events. In addition, the Times wire service retails the establishment line to subsidiary outlets such as broadcast news distributors and regional newspapers. Competition between these outlets rests primarily on the style of regurgitating the same message. In the early 1930s, Americans received much of their news about life in the Soviet Union from Walter Duranty, the New York Times man in Moscow. Duranty's articles filled the front pages with gripping stories from Mother Russia. During that period, Joseph Stalin was consolidating power over the captive nations that formed the Soviet Union. One step in that drive called for the forced relocation of millions of Ukrainians. Observing these events on the scene was British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge. He witnessed the loading of thousands of Ukrainians into boxcars. They were being deported to barren regions of the Soviet Union. This program of Stalin's alone accounted for more than 1 million deaths.
This is the most terrible thing I've ever seen. It precisely because of the deliberation with which it was done and the total absence of even any kind of sympathy.
Duranty's articles in the New York Times sharply contradicted Muggeridge's reports. Duranty went out of his way to dismiss them as bunk or sheer absurdity. During the deliberate famine of 1932 to 1933, more than 7 million Ukrainians perished when Stalin seized their entire grain crop for export. Still, in a March 1933 article, Duranty insisted there is no actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition.
That was when his reporting was particularly disgraceful, because he denied that there was any famine. And we used to wonder whether, in fact, the authorities hadn't got some kind of hold over him, because he so utterly played their game. But it didn't worry the New York Times, who featured his reports.
Ultimately, the cover-up of Stalin's crimes helped the communist regime gain diplomatic recognition from the United States. William F. Jasper is a senior editor for the New American Magazine.
The Soviet Union, like every communist country, was an economic basket case. It could not produce enough to survive. And so every communist socialist state has been dependent upon aid from the capitalist producing states. So Russia was desperate for our aid, both in terms of direct government aid, but also in terms of opening up the spigots for the private capital markets, particularly New York bankers and corporations, to move into Russia in a big way.
In 1933, the Roosevelt administration invited a Soviet representative to Washington to negotiate terms of diplomatic recognition. For his news correspondence during the previous year, Duranty would receive the Pulitzer Prize. Another Times correspondent, Herbert Matthews, also covered for collectivism. During the so-called Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, communists throughout Spain brutally massacred more than 6,000 priests, friars, and nuns. Matthews' dispatches, however, depicted the communists as idealistic Democrats seeking to liberate Spain from tyranny. No mention was made of the communist atrocities. Later, when the Times assigned Matthews to report on Cuba, he crafted an image of an obscure revolutionary as a romantic